Okay, today we're going to be looking at another player in the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger. And specifically, we're going to be looking at an activist investor by the name of ANCORA Alternatives. And going on in this video, I'm not going to be referring to them as ANCORA Alternatives. I'm just going to refer to them as ANCORA. They appear to be a subsidiary of ANCORA Holdings. All right, we're going to get into a lot of issues here. Before we get started, though, I wanted to provide a quote from the CEO or president of ANCORA Alternatives. That's a man by the name of Jim Chadwick. And I provide the information here at the bottom of the screen on the interview. It was with Morgan Brennan of CNBC, and that was on July 30th, 2025. So in that interview, at about the timestamp 1 minute and 40 seconds, if you listen to the conversation starting there, Jim Chadwick, the president of ANCORA Alternatives, states the following. This transcontinental railroad, led by whom we consider to be one of the greatest railroaders of this generation, Jim Vena. First point, he considers Jim Vena to be one of the greatest railroaders of modern times. And then he goes on and he speaks of two great operators getting together, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, led by the greatest railroad executive in the world today. So that is how Jim Chadwick views Jim Vena, the greatest railroader in the world today. Keep this quote in mind as we go on in these materials pertaining to Activist Investor ANCORA. And before I keep going into this material, I want to give you my personal opinion as an MA in finance. Not an MBA in finance, an MA in finance. That means my undergrad was finance, and so was the master's level. It was not an MBA where I could have, an undergrad in sociology or whatever and then do an MBA to study some basic business. My degree was hardcore finance from start to finish, all the way to the master's level. So I understand all too well the implications of all of this when it comes to issues such as financial fraud. And there are definitely issues of financial fraud when it comes to what was going on at CN. Under the likes of Jim Vena, in my humble opinion, and others, of course, like former chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern, Claude Mongeau, who used to be CEO at CN Rail when Jim Vena was chief operations officer when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And that death, again, was a complete and total cover-up. And this channel and the sister channel, Rail Families United, you need to look at all the videos on these channels because you can't just think, oh, well, this player is Canadian, and so it really doesn't impact this merger in the US as far as the issues in the background. Wrong. Jim Vena used to be a Canadian up in Canada. Now he's a key player in the US. And he's got a lot of history in Canada while he was at CN Rail. Skeletons that are now being disclosed via these two YouTube channels and my channel, my website called railfamiliesunited.com. I have posted more on the YouTube channels for now than I have on railfamilies.com, but I will be updating railfamilies.com also. I just know that, YouTube is a preferred way for people to view stuff and to get to information. But keep this quote in mind that according to ANCORA's president Jim Chadwick, Jim Vena, is the greatest railroad executive in the world today. I would beg to differ. And as an MA in finance, Mr. Chadwick, let me tell you, you are a man who is supposed to have attention to detail as a person in the financial world. When you're in finance, you need to have the ability to really look at details in terms of information that is put before you. And if you don't have that attention to detail when you are in a critical finance role, either preparing financial statements, evaluating financial statements, evaluating key documentation that's been put before you, then, if I was a rail investor or any type of investor, I would think twice before investing with someone who may lack, in my opinion, serious attention to detail. And we're going to get into these materials and show you exactly what I mean. Okay, what you have here is a picture of a business card for Lauren Turkisher, who was Chief Operating Officer at ANCORA Alternatives in April of 2024. That month, I had gone to visit my brother along with one of my sisters, and my brother lived in Ohio. And when I went there, I went and did this trip very much with the intent of delivering a lot of files to a whole lot of people. And so I went first to the office of J.D. Vance, again on this date, and I dropped off at the office of J.D. Vance a memory stick and a separate file, which I called my lawfare file for President Trump. On the memory sticks was basically about 6,000 pages of rather incriminating information pertaining to 3 massive scandals impacting both Canadian and U.S. national security. So when I gave this to the office of J.D. Vance, this was before President Trump picked him as his running mate. Then, after the office of J.D. Vance, I went to East Palestine, Ohio, and I found the uncle of a person who had been displaced by the East Palestine, Ohio, Norfolk Southern derailment, which devastated that community. And for him, I gave him a memory stick with 2,500 pages pertaining only to the rail scandal, because the not the chief operations officer, one of the people who was at Norfolk Southern at the time was former CN Rail CEO Claude Mongeau. And he had been a major player when conductor trainee Jason Cluney had been killed in Canada. So I went there and I told that man, feel free to share these 2,500 pages with whomever you feel needs to know. So took care of East Palestine, went on. The next place I went was the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, also based in Ohio. They represent about 116,000 locomotive engineers in the U.S. So went there and I spoke with someone who worked with their legal team, and I had only sent them a few emails before that, and now I wanted to give them more information. So they got about 2,500 pages of information. Then, after leaving the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, I went to ANCORA Alternatives, also based in Ohio. Now, the reason I went to ANCORA was because ANCORA was in the process of trying to do a hostile takeover of the Norfolk Southern board of directors, and they wanted to replace, I believe, the CEO and also the chief operations officer. And one of the people that they wanted to put there was a man by the name of Jamie Boychuk, a name I knew all too well, because Jamie Boychuk was general manager of the Prairie subdivision for CN Rail in Canada when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed, and when my own child, who had been a conductor trainee at the same time as Jamie Boychuk, was also fake qualified and allowed to go from a terminal with 2 or 3 switches a day, 2 or 3 trains a day, to a terminal with potentially hundreds of switches and 40 to 60 trains a day on the main line with 0 yard training. Well, you know, if you're going to put my child's life at risk like that, you are on my shit list. Excuse the language, but you, buddy, I'm going to expose your wrongdoing. And so that was the purpose of my visit to ANCORA, because I needed to talk to someone about the fact that ANCORA was trying to put Jamie Boychuk as Chief Operations Officer for Norfolk Southern. So when I went to ANCORA, to this particular location, when I got there, there was only one person at the main level sitting at a computer. And I walked up to her and she said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I would like to speak to someone about the fact that you guys want to put Jamie Boychuk as Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern, when in my opinion that man belongs in jail for fake qualifying frontline rail workers and for death cover-ups in Canada." And and folks, there is no way that Jamie Boychuk would not have known that the employees below him on the front lines were being fake qualified. You were general manager in that area. How could you not know this? So, anyways, the woman just kind of looks at me, her jaw drops, and she says, "Okay, who would you like to speak to?" And I said, "I want to speak to the highest person you can possibly give me today." And she goes, "Okay, have a seat." I'm sitting down in their waiting area on this main floor, and then this woman comes up to me, hands me this business card, Lauren Turkisher. When she handed me her card, I literally told her, "Oh, you're pretty brave. A lot of people may have an issue with giving me their business card." And she goes, "I have no problem with giving you my business card." The one thing I will say that is positive for ANCORA is the fact that this person actually agreed to see me that day. Of course, the issue was a kind of severe issue, rather important. So, yeah, I guess it would be a good thing to speak to me if I'm there to talk to you. And she told me, she goes, "I'm in a meeting." She goes, "I've got about 20 more minutes. And then she goes, "I'm going to bring you up to a conference room. You can sit there, take whatever you want to eat, drink, whatever. And she goes, "I will be with you in about 20 minutes and we can talk." I said, "Okay." She brings me up to this conference room, and that's where I waited for her. Now, if you look on her business card here, at the bottom, you can see her email address and the format of that email. And so when I would follow up later after this meeting to document the events of that day, what had happened, and to document the issues, I didn't just send the documentation to her. I also sent it to other players, including Jim Chadwick, who was the president of ANCORA Alternatives. And I went based on this format for Jim Chadwick and others at ANCORA Alternatives. So if this information did not get to Jim Chadwick, well, I guess I would apologize for that, but it most certainly did get to Lauren Turkisher because I had her exact email. And I also would think that if you get the type of information that I was sending you and documenting, not only with you, but also with the lawyers that were involved in that hostile takeover of the Norfolk Southern board. I CC'd the legal team that ANCORA was using. And, I told that legal team, fail to disclose material facts to investors when you now know what you know, and I've given you these files. Folks, there are many who would think that's financial fraud. So before you put a guy like Jamie Boychuk in that company, in that role, in my opinion, putting the lives of frontline rail workers at risk, given what had happened in Canada. And not only was Jamie Boychuk he was general manager for the Prairie subdivision when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed in Saskatchewan. Well, buddy, it was also you that allowed my child to go from a terminal of just a few switches, a few trains a day, to this other one with, potentially hundreds of switches and dozens of trains a day with 0 yard training. And again, you do that and put my child's life at risk, and buddy, I will expose you. So anyways, when I followed up, I told these lawyers also in the email, failure to disclose material facts, and you're asking stockholders to vote on a proxy vote for your potential hostile takeover of the board of directors in several key positions like chief operations officer, CEO, whatever, at Norfolk Southern. When you've got this information and you fail to disclose that information, and you're asking investors to vote for your slate of candidates, which included Jamie Boychuk, I said, I'm an MA in finance, folks, and there are many who would consider that failure to disclose material facts financial fraud. And when I say I'm an MA in finance, you need to understand an MA is very different from an MBA. When you're an MBA, you can have an undergrad in sociology, you can have an undergrad in basket weaving, and then you go into a master's program for basic business courses. An MBA is very different than an MA. An MA in finance, my undergrad focused on finance, and my master's level was pretty well all hardcore finance classes. And so I understood the issues before me as far as the financial fraud, the implications for rail investors, the implications for rail customers. I understood all the financial fraud here that was going on, and that had been going on for a very long time at CN Rail and in Canada, where regulators had turned a blind eye to far too much for far too long, and in my opinion had become what I call RAILPICs, rail partners in crime, turning a blind eye to far too much, and not just that, but helping when there was a death to provide convenient, appropriate death cover-ups. So I know enough as the daughter of a coroner that families have a right to the truth. And I had dragged the parents of conductor trainee Jason Cluney through a living nightmare for years as I exposed so many things that had been hidden from his parents. They had been told virtually nothing about the death of their son, other than the fact he flipped a switch the wrong way and turned a movement onto himself. And there's a lot of stuff behind that which was not disclosed, including a lot of deadly training materials that were used under the likes of Jamie Boychuk, of Jim Vena, who was UP CEO, and of Claude Mongeau, who had been chairman of the board at the time, who was now chairman of the board he wasn't chairman yet, but he was on the board of directors at Norfolk Southern, and then he would go on to become chairman of the board. Something I, to this day, do not understand how ANCORA allowed that to happen, but whatever, let's move on. So the lawyers for ANCORA knew that, there's problems on the horizon. And when I met with Lauren Turkisher, and I went up there and I, I got to give her credit to take the meeting that was completely unscheduled. But when I met with her, I told her that I was an MA in finance as I held this visual one, the file all marked up in red ink pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. And I also showed her the lawfare file I had prepared for President Trump. Well, when I showed her that file, obviously she could see there were problems. And I said, Jamie Boychuk was general manager of this area when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And he allowed my child to go to this massive terminal with 0 yard training. And so these issues were near and dear to my heart, especially since as I saw my child lose more and more coworkers, one of them could have been my child that night instead of a friend and coworker. And that's when my research started, and I had no idea how ugly it would become and how long it would take, literally years, to uncover all these issues and document them. And I told Lauren Turkisher, I'm an MA in finance, and I said, I won't care if your valuation goes to 0. If you keep pushing for Jamie Boychuk to be Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern, I will expose you. And, she kind of looked at me and was rather silent in the meeting and just kind of said, okay. And when I left that meeting, I'm sure her jaw was kind of on the floor. But you would think that as a Chief Operating Officer, especially after I then followed up an email with documentation proving what I was saying, you would think that she would have brought that up and discussed it with Jim Chadwick, the president of ANCORA Alternatives. So that's how that meeting happened. And I just wanted to give you the history of that. But again, this is, a picture of her business card. I think the mark under ANCORA there, that's me that wrote that with a pen when I was checking to see if a pen was working. But this is her business card, and I would have it to this day, and will keep it, of proof of the fact that I had met with Lauren Turkisher about these issues. And I even told her, I said, why do you think the Surface Transportation Board and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen are against you trying to put Jamie Boychuk in that role? I go, do you think they might have known something? What was weird was in the press, some members of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen kind of made it look like they were for this slate of candidates. And after my meeting with them and after having met with Lauren Turkisher, I called the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen because it was making it look in the press as though they were in favor of this slate of candidate now. And I talked to the guy that I had gone and met with, and I said, what's going on with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen? I go, are you guys for this slate of candidates, including Jamie Boychuk? And he goes, oh no, we're telling our people behind the scenes to vote against Jamie Boychuk. So that's the background to this meeting and how I got Lauren Turkisher's email and hence the format for emails at this corporation. And that's the format I use to send emails to Jim Chadwick and others at ANCORA. And I also sent emails to, I had CC'd some key unions that I had not spoken to. I sent the documentation to SMART TD, which is the union representing conductors in the U.S., and I also sent it to the Brotherhood for the Maintenance of Way employees, which do the track maintenance. So ANCORA knew they had problems, and Jamie Boychuk did not get in as Chief Operations Officer. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if ANCORA itself voted against its own candidate in that one. But that's just my hunch. But I was glad to see that he did not get in, and I'm sure that the frontline rail workers were also glad to see he did not get in. But, as you will see, ANCORA seems to still have plans for Jamie Boychuk. There's something I need to clarify here. When I say that it was Jamie Boychuk that allowed my child to go from a very, very small terminal to this massive one with 0-yard training, that was done through the systems at CN Rail, because my child was now a fully qualified conductor, but at the terminal where they were working, they could only hold brakemen because there were too many conductors there already that had more seniority. And so if you're a qualified conductor and all you can hold is brakemen, that affects your salary. And so the union rules were such that if you're a qualified conductor and all you can hold is brakemen, you have the right to apply out of that terminal to a shortage terminal, which doesn't have enough conductors, and the systems, the code, will move you automatically. You won't even need your direct supervisor's authority to do that. That's just based on the union rules. But here's the issue. If you were Jamie Boychuk, you should have known to at least make sure that if your system is moving people, you better make sure they're properly qualified to go from this little rink-a-dink terminal to a massive terminal, especially if there's fake qualification that's been going on at CN Rail. And that was going on dating back not just to 2013, but I can absolutely prove to 2007. And Jamie Boychuk had been at CN Rail for quite some time. How could you not know, if you work anywhere in operations, that there's fake qualifications going on? How can you not know about your deadly training materials that were used to train potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of frontline rail workers? How could you not know that you're not giving frontline rail workers all the training you were supposed to be giving them? How could you not know that the Railway Safety Act was being violated as training programs were being changed without going through proper procedures, without filing changes with Transport Canada for approval prior to field implementation? And I'm talking deadly field practices that were going on at CN Rail under the likes of Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, and Claude Mongeau. So for you guys to say, we didn't know we were violating the laws, I'm sorry, but you've been in the rail industry far too long, and ignorance of the law is no defense. There's no way that you can argue you don't know about the laws for the industry in which you operate when you've been there for decades. And so, in my opinion, zero excuse for the likes of Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, and Claude Mongeau. They had to know that there was fake qualifications going on, and they had to know that they were violating the Railway Safety Act, labor laws, and on and on and on. When conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed, and potentially in other deaths too. I only looked at the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. I started looking at another death, and I've looked at other railway investigation reports for things like managers at the controls. So these are all issues that are going to be addressed on these YouTube channels. And it's not pretty information. When I, have a logo for Rail Families United, and that logo at the bottom says, strong ties through hard truths, these are very hard truths being exposed via these YouTube channels. All right, so what you have here is copies of my follow-up emails after my meeting with Lauren Turkisher. And you can see here, this one email was entitled Liabilities, Boychuk/Mongeau and Material Facts Concealed. And at the top you can see J. Chadwick, and I'd used the format that was on Lauren Turkisher's business card. You can see that, she's on the email here. If you look at the red arrows, you can see that the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen was on this distribution list. So was Smart TD Union. So was the Surface Transportation Board. And then there's the legal teams that were involved. The Federal Railway Administration was on this email. Also, at the bottom here, if you can see, it says Michael Duhaime at RCMP. The GRC is the French for RCMP. So that was the commissioner of the RCMP in Canada. And then the Teamsters Canada Rail Union, representing rail workers in Canada, was on this email. And you could see this is this had the visual file, which is that document from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada's death investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. The document I had totally marked up in red ink. That's that one. But if you look lower here, the very bottom arrow on the left clearly shows that they had received 10 attachments in this email. And that was dated the 27th of April in 2024. So again, I certainly did try to send this documentation to Jim Chadwick at ANCORA Alternatives. And because Lauren Turkisher was on this email, looking at who's on here, should you maybe take this email seriously? Should you maybe bring it up to the CEO or the president of the company to make sure that he saw this email and read it and read the attachments? I think you should, especially if you're in the middle of a hostile takeover for a board and key positions at ANCORA or at Norfolk Southern. So this is just a copy of one of these emails. Now on this screen print here, I opened up to show the names of all 10 documents that had been provided in this email to all these people at ANCORA, their lawyers, etc. And one of those documents was the Index of Documents, where that was a 15-page document, and it basically provided a summary of all the files I had given to regulators, basically in Canada and the US, as well as other parties. And it said how many pages was each document, and it provided the name or the title of the document, how many pages it had, and a brief description of what was in those documents. And so that also went to Lauren Turkisher and Jim Chadwick, provided that was his email address, given the format on Lauren Turkisher's business card. Okay, so what you have here is the first couple of paragraphs in that file called Index of Documents, which had gone to Lauren Turkisher, the attorneys that represented ANCORA in their hostile takeover attempt for Norfolk Southern, and others. It had gone to the RCMP commissioner, the Maintenance of Way Union, the Conductors Union, the Locomotive Engineers Union, and several others. And so, if you're ANCORA and the president of ANCORA or the chief operating officer, you would think that you would pay attention to detail in these matters, because these were very serious issues that I was raising with them 10 days before their vote was, or about 10 days before their vote was supposed to take place. And I'm telling them, you better stop Jamie Boychuk from becoming Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern, or I will expose you for failure to disclose material facts to investors when you're asking them to vote on Jamie Boychuk, given what I'm telling you. So I don't know why they also didn't remove Claude Mongeau from the running for board of directors. That's another issue, but one that I would definitely ask of Mr. Chadwick. But anyways, so if you look here at the first paragraph and the index of documents, again, this provided a summary of what was in 2,500 very incriminating pages that had not just been given to the unions and to ANCORA. They may not have received the whole 2,500 pages, but they certainly received enough to know there were serious issues. But, you know, the 2,500 pages had absolutely been given to the Surface Transportation Board, to the Federal Railway Administration, the RCMP, and on and on and on. And ANCORA had been given enough files to know there were some serious issues. And the same would be true for the lawyers that were representing ANCORA in this hostile takeover of Norfolk Southern. So if you look here at the very first paragraph in this file, and I underlined it in red here, it was not underlined for ANCORA, they just got the file. But if you'd read the first paragraph, I would think that you would have concerns here. Because if you look at what I underlined, what is stated here? It says, this was when I had created this document when billionaire Chris Hone of TCI was trying to take over the board of CN Rail. And two of the major players at CN Rail that Mr. Hone wanted to put in key roles were the CEO and board members. Let's see, he wanted to put Jim Vena as CEO for CN Rail, and this other guy, Paul Miller, who was a VP of safety, okay? But the fact that the name Jim Vena is there, okay? I said two of the key players Mr. Hone is trying to put into roles of CEO and board member are Jim Vena, former Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail, is in the running for the CEO job, and Paul Miller, who was a VP of safety, okay? I said TCI wanted to put Paul Miller, I think, on the board of directors. Mr. Hone has hired 3 law firms to advise him in these matters, 2 in Canada and 1 in the US. The issue with Vena and Miller is that they were both in key roles when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed, and there is no way that these 2 men could not have known that CN Rail was violating the law, SOR 87-150, specifically Section 5, as well as others, the Railway Safety Act, labor laws, whatever, and doing so for years, with many in oversight roles and or investigative roles, turning a blind eye to all of these violations of so many laws, and not only turning a blind eye to it all, but helping with appropriate cover-ups when incidents, even deaths, occurred. If you look further down here, the arrow where I blacked out, it even said that I had filed a formal Securities and Exchange Commission complaint over these issues with the SEC against CN Rail and the Government of Canada. Now that complaint and these issues were filed under the Obama administration. And I very strongly suspect the issues were not disclosed to President Trump. But I disclosed them to President Trump via Jim Jordan and J.D. Vance, having given them the files. And so, as one of 3 massive scandals. And so if you know there's an SEC filing that might be out there, that might become an issue under the Trump administration, in 2024, when Trump is running for president, do you think maybe that those at ANCORA who saw the RCMP on the distribution list, who saw the Surface Transportation Board, the Federal Railway Administration also on the distribution list for the email that had this attachment, do you think maybe you should have had attention to detail as a finance person, especially one trying to take over the board at Norfolk Southern, where some of these key players were, and where you were trying to put people in key roles like Jamie Boychuk, the CEO, the former CEO of CN Rail, Claude Mongeau, who would go on to become chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern? Explain that one to me, ANCORA. But anyways, you think that maybe if they had taken the time to read the information provided to them and seen the name here, Jim Vena. If you look at the arrow on the left, Jim Vena, why would you not have remembered that if, in fact, Jim Chadwick considered Jim Vena to be the greatest railroader in the world, as we saw at the opening of these materials? That if Jim Chadwick thought really that this person is the greatest railroader to ever have lived, do you think that maybe you should have had attention to detail here when you saw the name Jim Vena in materials provided to you? Do you think that maybe you should have remembered that as you now are pushing for a UP Norfolk Southern merger with the supposed greatest railroader in the world, Jim Vena, to be CEO over that proposed merged company? You know, attention to detail, having a good memory, those are key things when you're in the world of finance. How can you just not remember this document, especially if you had been made aware of issues with Jamie Boychuk, and now you're going to see that it appears Jamie Boychuk had a potential role in this, in advising ANCORA in this supposed merger of UP and Norfolk Southern. So, you know, just saying, folks, maybe I have greater attention to detail than other people, but if you are pushing for Jim Vena to be CEO at UP Norfolk Southern if they do merge, I don't know, but you should have an issue with that given this information that you had been provided with only a year ago. In 2024, you had been given this information in 2024 at ANCORA Alternatives. And you're still pushing for this? For these people to be in here? To be part of, you know, these financial decisions and whatever? You know, is it that you're thinking, hey, if Jim Vena can get away with what he got away with in Canada and he had people helping him, turning a blind eye to all his wrongdoing as Chief Operations Officer, and even providing appropriate death cover-ups when somebody died under his watch, when there were so many violations of the law under his watch? Is that why ANCORA thinks maybe Jim Vena would be a good person to have on board? Because he's got all these connections that'll help cover his butt? Boy, if that's your attitude, and I'm not saying it is, but if that is, I would have a serious problem with the leadership of ANCORA. And, you know, it's like I told them, or told Lauren Turkisher, I don't care if your valuation goes to zero, honey. I will expose the wrongdoing I need to expose. And if this company isn't smart enough to stand far away from some of these players, given what they were provided with in April of 2024, you know, and apparently there were discussions going on for months before the proposed merger for UP and Norfolk Southern was even announced. So if that's the case, you know, this would not have been that much earlier than all those discussions that were happening in the background. So why in the world would ANCORA and the president of ANCORA say that Jim Vena was the best railroader in the world? I'm sorry, buddy, but I would disagree with that assessment, because in my opinion, this man belongs behind bars. That's my opinion. Okay, before I leave this page, I want you to notice the green arrow I've added here at the top. Um, this was in a file folder. I did a backup of my files in February 2025. I back up periodically. And you could see that this was in a folder where one of the folders was called New York versus Trump. Um, New York versus Trump was a folder that I had created for all the documents pertaining to the three massive scandals I had given to J.D. Vance and to Jim Jordan to give to President Trump. And when I was meeting with Lauren Turkisher, one of the files I showed her was a 60-page file that I had in a little binder. Um, and that file had the names of several people that would have had to-dos in my three massive scandals. Not all of them, but several of them had. It was basically a join the dots for President Trump file, looking at one law firm specifically and all of the players that were associated with this one law firm, and how a lot of these players had a role in the many Securities and Exchange Commission complaints I had filed under the Obama administration pertaining to the massive scandals that I was now dropping on the desk of President Trump via J.D. Vance and Jim Jordan. So that lawfare file, I call it the lawfare file, the 60 pages. You know, if I could knock out 5 to 10 players who were going after Trump in the New York lawfare, you might think that's just coincidence. But what if I can join dots to some of these players for 25 to 27 of them? And we're talking key players like Alvin Bragg, you know, lead prosecutors, the lead investigator, the lead forensic accounting firm. If I can join some dots there that these people had a role to do in my issues, but they did nothing. And now these same people are going after Trump in New York in that lawfare? Well, you know, in my opinion, folks, and that was a 60-page file, okay, exposing all those, joining all those dots for President Trump. Well, what and when I gave it to President Trump, I also gave a copy to Jim Jordan for him, and then I had 3 other copies, one for President Trump and 2 for his lawyers. One of them was Todd Blanche, of course, who's now the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. Now, folks, you know, you have to I have no doubt, quite frankly, that the people who were going after Trump in the New York lawfare were going after him perhaps for much more personal reasons than most would know. Because in my opinion, the bottom line was, given these scandals and the fact that so many of them should have done their jobs in previous roles but failed to do so, well, maybe the issue was really either we go after Trump and keep him out of the White House or throw him in jail, or maybe President Trump can throw all of us in jail. Something to think about, right? So Lauren Turkisher had seen that this file existed. And so did the person who was at the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. I briefly showed it to that person too. So they knew this file was out there. And it's a beautiful file, if I do say so myself. Okay, in an article by Freightwaves entitled Activist Investor May Target CSX Citing Slumping Financial Performance, and this appeared July 31st, 2025. It was stated in that article that former CSX Chief Operating Officer Jamie Boychuk, who was ANCORA's candidate to replace Norfolk Southern's operations chief during the proxy contest, has been advising the Cleveland-based investor about CSX, Chadwick said. Okay, and so at the bottom it says here when the ANCORA is being asked about whether or not, they're going to be doing any moves pertaining to CSX as far as being an activist investor. Well, Chadwick stated, whatever actions they make as far as CSX from here will dictate what we do. Well, first of all, I would ask Mr. Chadwick, given the information that was provided to your company, as far as Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, Claude Mongeau, why would you retain Jamie Boychuk as an advisor in any matters pertaining to CSX when you know there could be some serious issues as far as fake qualifications and death cover-ups and violations of the Railway Safety Act or whatever tied to Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, and Claude Mongeau? You know, why would you retain this guy as an advisor? I don't care if he was CSX Chief Operations Officer. Had I known that he was going for that position, I would have tried to inform CSX of that. Jamie Boychuk ended up being let go at CSX not long after I did send an email to key people pertaining to the fact that Jamie Boychuk was CSX Chief Operations Officer. But anyways, why in the world would Mr. Chadwick have anything to do with the likes of Jamie Boychuk, given the information he was clearly provided with, and ANCORA was clearly provided with, via Lauren Turkisher? And these comments like whatever action they make from here will dictate what we do. I'm sorry, but you know what? Maybe it's just me, but Mr. Chadwick, I have huge issues with your ethics and your company's ethics. If you retain the likes of Jamie Boychuk as an advisor, given what you know and the files you were provided, and with your ethics with referring to Jim Vena as the greatest railroader in the world, what in the world are you thinking? I guess that would be my question. And why are you thinking of putting Jamie Boychuk in a key position at U.S. Steel? Because that's another group that you are apparently an activist investor for. What in the world are you thinking? I don't know. I think there's serious questions that need to be answered by James Chadwick and the people at ANCORA as far as their ethics and what they view as great railroaders and great advisors and whatever. There's an expression, birds of a feather flock together. Is this revealing something about ANCORA that maybe investors should be aware of? I'm just saying I have a question in these matters. And I think most investors would also have questions in matters of ethics and what will or will not be tolerated by activist investors. A lot of people are afraid of activist investors, especially railroaders and CEOs and board members and whatever, because these activist investors have billions of dollars, right? Well, those billions of dollars could disappear pretty fast if investors maybe start to see things they weren't seeing before. So, I have an issue with the whole thing of activist investors even being allowed to attempt to take over boards and key positions in things like major rail carriers and whatever. Especially when, you're given information and you seem to just ignore that information, right? Oh, who's going to find out? Who's going to know? It's just this little mother in the middle of nowhere. Who's going to know? Oh, there's nothing like a determined mother to put people in their place, is what I would tell you, sir. Because there is nothing like the instinct of a mother to protect their child. You don't want to go up against that instinct. And it's one that I seem to really have as a very strong instinct, if you ask me, because I will do everything I need to do to protect my child, not only from the likes of Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, Claude Mongeau, but also from the likes of any activist investor who thinks that they can ignore such serious issues and push these people forward and pretend that they're great financial wizards. Well, sir, I'm here to tell you, there's nothing like an ugly scandal to make investors run. And if you haven't learned that yet, maybe it's time that you do. That's my humble opinion, and that's all I'm going to say on this. Okay, this is just a screen print of some of the emails that went to Lauren Turkisher and others, at ANCORA and to other people. But she was definitely on these distribution lists. And you can see here just from the titles, huge violations of laws, managers at the controls. That's an issue for both. It was for both CN and CP Rail. And then in law, silence is consent. So, if ANCORA remains silent in these issues that have been brought to their attention, in law, silence is consent. So you're fine with all of these issues? You have no problems with the likes of Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, and Claude Mongeau being in key roles? Potentially putting the lives of frontline rail workers at risk in the U.S.? As an activist investor, are you going to continue to help invest or infest the U.S. rail industry with the likes of these rail executives that, in my humble opinion, quite frankly, belong behind bars? That's my opinion based on my research. You're entitled to form your own as you go through all the videos and the documentation that is provided not only on this YouTube channel, but on my sister YouTube channel called Rail Families United, and also on my website, railfamiliesunited.com, which I need to update more on there, but I'll get to that. But anyways, so, in law, silence is consent. And yeah, I think you would have some very serious questions to answer for investors if you keep pushing people like this forward in the rail industry. Or, I'm just so against this whole thing of activist investors taking over boards and trying to make decisions for the rest of shareholders, for all the other shareholders in a company. It shouldn't be allowed, in my humble opinion. I don't care how many billions you have. It should not be allowed. Because we're seeing the effects of that type of stuff, right? We're seeing the effects of what can happen when that disaster is allowed to happen. Then there's, let's see, the backlash on my family. Oh yeah, my child has experienced quite a bit of backlash at work. Then there's belt pack woes, huge issues. And, yeah, that would have been under the likes of Jim Vena and Claude Mongeau and Jamie Boychuk. Huge issues. If you look at all of these issues here that were raised, how in the world can ANCORA justify keeping Jamie Boychuk in any significant role, or wanting to place them as an advisor or a board member, maybe at U.S. Steel? Yeah. You can allow people like that to destroy those companies and put the lives of those workers at risk? People that take shortcuts and do whatever they think they can do because they think they're above the law, right? We make millions, and activist investors, we're worth billions, right? Well, like I told you, nothing like a good scandal to make those billions evaporate. Oh man, if I was an activist investor, quite frankly, seeing this case study, I'd say, we're not going to be doing this type of stuff in the future because, like I told you, all you need is one activist mother. And how many do you think there are of those in the world? And how many more do you think there will be as more and more rail families, and I'm talking frontline rail workers, rail customers, other rail investors, taxpayers, members of the general public, find out about these issues? How many more activist mothers will activist investors be willing to face? Because I won't back down. I'll tell you that right now. I will do what I need to do to protect my child and other frontline rail workers and expose these issues that have far too long been hidden from far too many. So the documentation is massive is all I can say. Trust me, the issues were well documented before I decided to make them very public. Okay, there's another point I'd like to make here. When you look at the people, who've been on the distribution list, who've received so much of this documentation, the first arrows at the top here, those are all rail unions, massive rail unions. 3 of them are in the US. Then you can see the 2 arrows kind of angled on the right. Those are the Surface Transportation Board and the Federal Railway Administration. And then the one on the bottom left, Marie-Claude Bibeau. She was the Minister of National Revenue for Canada. In other words, Canada's IRS. And as we move forward into these discussions and this becomes a bigger issue in the US, I'll also be including probably the US Treasury and the IRS in emails. And I'll tell you why. And Activist Investor ANCORA and all other activist investors out there, hope you're listening. Unions collect union dues tax-free, provided they act solely in the interest of the union and its members. And so all those millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of union dues that have been collected, my child pays hundreds of dollars every month in union dues to retain their membership in the conductors union as well as the locomotive union. And so, they pay a lot of money every month. And this adds up to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for rail unions. So do you really think that when things hit the fan, that rail unions will have any choice as to which side to go on in these matters? Because if they don't protect frontline rail workers in these issues and pick the proper side, boy, it wouldn't take much for a class action lawyer to say, you haven't done your job protecting your frontline rail workers. And so all those union dues you've been collecting tax-free, I think they need to be something those of us in finance know as taxable income. And so if activist investors like ANCORA think that they're going to take over boards and that the unions won't have a say, I don't think the unions are going to throw their hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions or whatever under the bus for any activist investor. They would have far too much at stake and far too much to lose. As, breach of fiduciary duties is also a criminal offense. And they've got some serious fiduciary duties as unions representing frontline rail workers. And so, yes, the Canadian equivalent of the IRS has definitely been brought on board with these issues in a whole lot of emails. So the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, they know. You better pick the right side in these issues. And the same is true for the unions in the US. The unions will never have the chance to fight for rail worker safety, for, two-person crews, whatever, as much as they will now because of these issues. And again, you're not just going to have one activist mother to deal with. I think as more and more families tied to the rail industry, rail customers, rail investors, taxpayers, who may have to flip the bill for wrongdoing by the government of Canada. Oh, that's going to go over real well, too. There's a reason Chrystia Freeland, who was Deputy Prime Minister under Justin Trudeau, is now Minister of Transportation in Canada. And why it's now on her radar to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation and all frontline rail worker training programs. Because they know, and she knows, as also the former Minister of Finance of Canada, who failed to disclose these issues to rail investors. You were hiding a whole lot of wrongdoing because you were a rail partner in crime. That's my humble opinion when it comes to the government of Canada. And so, class action lawsuits, those punitive damages can be pretty massive. And nobody has the right to use my intellectual property without my written consent. And so, if the lawsuits are going to fly, yeah, I will definitely help a class action lawsuit to go after perpetrators of the so many violations of laws. And yes, if it comes to that, even activist investors who may be deceiving investors and asking them to vote for certain candidates when those people probably shouldn't be anywhere in the vicinity as advisors or whatever, in my humble opinion. So I don't care how many billions you have, billions evaporate quickly when there's scandals. And this one is so massive because there's at least 5 Class 1 rail carriers that have been impacted now. And again, just getting rid of a player here and there, the Jamie Boychuk, the Jim Vena or whatever, not good enough. We need some compliance audits to be done, not just once or twice, on an ongoing basis at all Class 1 rail carriers to ensure that all frontline rail workers are getting all the training they need, to ensure that there's not changes to rail worker training programs that are in violation of the law, rail worker training program changes that were not implemented without prior approval by the proper authorities, like Transport Canada, or in the States, if that's the railway, the Federal Railway Administration, whatever. You can't just willy-nilly go and implement deadly program changes without having proper approval to do so. And so, I suspect there's going to be a lot more activists, not on the investor side, activist mothers and family members. And every single time that one rail worker gets killed or seriously injured, activist investors, rail unions had better remember that, as well as regulators in the rail industry. Because all of you have a great deal to lose, a great deal at stake. So for any union that thinks it's going to side with, rail carriers in any of these issues, you'd better think twice. It's not going to happen. Do that, and you could be facing a class action lawsuit by rail workers, frontline rail workers, and their families. Just saying, putting all the cards on the table, folks, so that you understand the implications of all this. I'm an MA in finance, and I fully understand the implications of a whole lot of this. And I hope to enlighten people like Activist Investor ANCORA in the implications of all of this. Again, activist investors, in my opinion, should simply not be allowed to take over boards and change out key positions. It just should not be allowed. That whoever's got the most money, we get to determine who's on the board, no matter how corrupt they may be. That should not be allowed. Not at the expense of frontline workers, be that in the rail industry or any other industry. It should not be allowed. Okay, in this email here again to Lauren Turkisher, there's files that were provided to her that all these so much so wrong files, and again the index file I had updated a little bit, but in this email you can clearly see the issues with Jim Vena and the operational excellence at CN Rail. And I think that would have also been, again, at the time of Jamie Boychuk, Claude Mongeau, that whole trio at CN Rail when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. Now, the issue here is that these files show how deadly some of the training slides were. As far as track configurations being shown when they were the exact opposite of what should have been shown to frontline rail workers in training. And wrong switch numbers, outdated training materials, all kinds of issues, outdated test questions, and on and on and on. When you're referring to Jim Vena, who was at the time the Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail, as the greatest railroader in the world, given what was exposed during the death, because of the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, via my investigation and dissection of that rail worker death investigation. Again, ANCORA has been given more than enough to know that there were serious problems with Jamie Boychuk, Jim Vena, and Claude Mongeau. And yet, what has ANCORA done when it comes to these people? Claude Mongeau recently stepped down on June 3rd or 4th of 2025 as the chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern. Well, I can't help but wonder if that's because maybe the government of Canada told them videos are coming out, and because I did tell them that this would be their year of disclosure, and they know it's coming. So anyways, I'm just telling you, I have serious issues with the ethics of Activist Investor ANCORA and its leadership team. That's my humble opinion. You're free to form your own. But again, the files they received were more than enough for them to realize they had some serious, serious problems on their hands when it came to these individuals. Okay, this final slide here, as far as the materials to be presented, shows that Lauren Turkisher, the woman I met with, and this is per a February 18th, 2025 article in Crane's Cleveland Business on basically, let's see, it's about people on the move and whatever in the business world in that area. Lauren Turkisher of ANCORA has been promoted to Vice President, Hedge Fund Operations. And she will provide operations support for the firm's alternative investment products. So, congratulations to you, Lauren. The only good thing I will say about ANCORA was that Lauren Turkisher actually met with me, took the time to listen. But from then on, how much did you speak up, Lauren, when it came to the issues that were brought to your attention? And I guess that would be my question. So, whatever. That's all I'm going to say. Congratulations on your promotion, Lauren. Whether or not I would personally trust Activist Investor ANCORA, that's a whole other issue. And personally, based on what I'm seeing, I wouldn't trust you any further than I can throw you. That's my personal opinion, and everybody else is free to form their own. Okay, so this is going to conclude the video looking at the players, specifically Activist Investor ANCORA, and its role in the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merger. And I also want to remind you to look at the video series and all the videos that are provided at the sister channel to this one called Rail Families United on YouTube. There's a whole player series that's going to be posted there. I post basically one video every day on that website almost, or on that channel. And it's important to understand all of the background, the history, all of the information that now plays into this Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger. So don't assume again that if a player is a Canadian player, a prime minister, a minister of transportation, whatever, that those players did not play a role in what's now going on in the U.S. Because again, 5 Class 1 rail carriers in the U.S. are now impacted by these issues, in my humble opinion, given the fact that players have moved around over the years and they've had the opportunity to infest, and I do mean infest, the U.S. rail industry with their operational excellence and or field practices and whatever else. So I will have a great day, and I will see you on the next one.